Hello, it's Cried here with a first look video on Elden Ring's patch 1.07. I say first look, but I actually spent dozens of hours on this already. It's more like my 100th look. Even then, this will not be the complete version. But if you know my style, you will be expecting a lot of actual numbers. I wanted to push this video out because I think there are plenty of misconceptions that would be better to clear up earlier. I also want to help my loyal subs that do watch my videos a significant advantage in PvP in the short term by sharing some knowledge with you before other people have caught on. Okay, let's get things started. I never thought this day would come, but it looks like over 17 million copies sold does indeed make a difference. We are actually getting different PvP balancing. Holy smokes. They actually have the ability to bring us better PvP balancing without messing up PvE things anymore. So let's take an immediate look at what they changed. Ashes of War do less damage in PvP. This is great because Ashes of War are powerful, and many of them chunked half your health easily without a heavy FP cost. This is definitely a great first step. The modifier seems to be a 20% reduction before the defense calculation step. Next, the Dragon Breaths and Unendurable Frenzy are nerfed in PvP. While these are indeed FP costly, they do cover quite the area and can be very powerful. I believe this change was made mostly so that invasions versus incantation users weren't so spammy and they can't just freely control a large area. I think this is fine. Increased stamina damage in PvP. This seems like a 25% increase in all stamina damage dealt in PvP. Combine this with the fact that Great Shield Talisman and Hammer Talisman are also tweaked. It shows that From understands that blocking is too strong of a tool in PvP. This is definitely a good change. The Fingerprint Shield is an outlier too, so the nerf here is also well deserved. Furthermore, the Great Shield Talisman and the spells, skills, and greases that affect shields seem to work better on lower base guard boost shields than higher guard boost shields now. They're basically trying to make it so that you can't use these buffs to gain an invincible shield that takes next to no stamina damage, while also making it more effective on weaker shields that previously didn't benefit enough from these buffs to guard boost. We will also cover things later, but the Kick Ash of War is finally doing its intended purpose of breaking blocks. Next, decrease the status buildup by dual-wielded weapons. Ah yes, an excellent change. The specifics can vary a bit here and there, but generally, the motion value modifiers for things such as power stance attacks, running attacks, and jump attacks have all turned from 90% status buildup on each weapon to 65% on each weapon. Combined, it is still 30% higher than using single weapons, but power stance status combos are certainly weaker. This is essentially a 27.8 decrease in status buildup. I'm quite happy with this change. Alright, everyone is talking about the poise change, but I'm really sorry I will have to burst your bubble about better fashion. While weaker gear did get a poise increase, which means that it is easier to reach 51 poise for PvE with a variety of fashion, poise is actually overall nerfed for PvP players. Allow me to explain. The poise damage of other PvP sources, like weapon attacks, are increased by 35%. For my dear casters, worry not. This also includes spells and incantations. All spells and incantations received a 35% increase in poise damage for PvP only. Also, weapons like hammers, great hammers, and some colossal weapons received a further boost to poise damage, but it wasn't a whole lot. As for two-handed bonus, it used to be 10% boost. They changed this to a 30% boost. For example, the old poise damage MV for two-handing was 110% for the light attack of a straight sword when two-handed, versus 100% when one-handed. It is currently 130%. This is a change that does make sense, because now two-handing deals more poise damage than power stancing. This buff is great, as two-handing didn't get a particularly big bonus before. What does this mean about poise breakpoints? Well, the old 61 poise breakpoint was set because plenty of things did 60 or less poise damage. Now 60 times 1.35 is 81. Add 1 point and we get 82 points of poise to poise through the 81 poise damage. What's the issue with this? Well, let's try optimizing poise. Pre 1.07 patch, this is the lowest weight combination you can get to 61 poise with and without the Borgos Talisman. After 1.07, these are the new numbers. If you are more observant, you will realize an issue. which is 82 poise, seems to require a ton more weight, especially without the Bull Goat's talisman. Indeed, with the Bull Goats, in order to reach the new 82 poise breakpoint, we need 13.2% more weight if we're only taking a look at armor. If we don't include the Bull Goat's talisman, we need a whooping 30.9% more. Therefore, this patch buffed poise damage more than poise defense. What this means is actually even though there are a lot more low weight armor that got a poise boost, your overall fashion is actually more limited if you want to reach this 82 poise mark. It also means that because the upper cap of poise is unchanged with the Bull Goat set still being 100 poise, while the other sets got buffed, Bull Goat Talisman is even stronger now as a tool to reach high poise. This is a quick new table I made for poise needed to tank all the weapons. I didn't double check all of them in game, so there might still be moves that are off by 1 poise. I'm sure someone will come up with a table again. If not, I'll make sure to make a certain list by the next video. One thing to note though, is two-handing now deals more poise damage than power stancing, so there is actually an additional 88 poise breakpoint I didn't use for my example when translating the old 61 poise breakpoint, as previously, two-handing the weapons that now deals 88 poise damage dealt less than 61 poise damage. Personally, I actually think poise is slightly overbuffed. I would have preferred something like a 20% general poise damage buff. Let me give you a few examples why. From the table, you can see weapons like two-handed thrusting swords now deal 71 poise damage, which is a lot more than it used to do. The first light attack comes out in 13 frames, and the second one comes out in 12 frames. The first hit is basically unreactable, and thrusting weapons are fairly long. Another example would be the rolling and crouching attack of a two-handed straight sword. Simply pick a long straight sword, for example, the Noble's S-Talk or a longsword. This crouch attack has an unreactable 11 frame startup, and now deals 88 poise damage. It means that if you don't have 88 poise, you better be on light rolls, because this is even more unreactable than Great Spear crouch attacks or UGS crouch attacks. This wasn't an issue before, because this move used to do only like 55 poise damage, which most people easily achieve because of the relatively easier to meet 61 poise breakpoint. I literally just proved to you how much more expensive poise is to get now. The poise change makes light weapons very powerful when the enemy doesn't meet the harder to reach poise breakpoint. Furthermore, a lot of weapons simply will stagger you, even if you go full Bull Goats with Bull Goat's Talisman, while many other weapon types also have the potential to definitely stagger you. I'm going to tell you straight up that going for 82 or 88 poise mark is definitely costlier, but can very easily be worth it. Two-handed thrusting sword is also a really strong option now, so you might want to go for 71 poise to tank it in addition to other less poise damage weapon arts. But overall, because poise is costlier, the alternative is to disregard most poise breakpoints and go for a light roll. With things as they are now, you're kind of forced to hit a high poise breakpoint for medium rolls, or go for light rolls to not get continuously staggered. Sigh. Patch 1.07 really sets back my light rolls video. Actually, I need to change a bunch of builds and other analysis as well. One more thing before we continue. I updated my gear compendium, which I made in one of my earliest videos, to 1.07 with all the new armor poise. I'll link the resource in the description down below, but this is basically a list of all the armor and some analytical data to help you decide on your armor if you're looking at more than poise. It's also linked in my Discord. Anyway, colossal swords and colossal weapons have their attack speed tweaked. While this is nice and all, I do hope From remembers there are other slow weapon classes too. It would be pretty weird if colossal swords swung at the same speed as great swords, right? Not to mention, poor Reapers seem to have the slowest light attacks now. Although a pleasant surprise for me was the nerf to colossal sword crouch pokes, which is now 17.33 frames instead of 14 frames. I gave the decimal here because they use the speed gradient to slow it down. You can just treat it as 17 frames if it makes things easier. Basically, this move takes 21.4% more frames before it comes out. Finally, a balanced move. Great Spear Crouch Poke still remains the ridiculously fast 13 frame startup. That could really use a tweak too. Increased guard penetration. They're really here to nerf shields in PvP. It isn't huge, but these weapons have 50% base shield pierce instead of 40% now. Man, it seems they're really preparing an arena. I think they just might introduce a PvP arena to Elden Ring in a future DLC. Fingers crossed. Let's talk about some spell changes first, and then some Ash of War changes. I won't have the full numbers for all of these, but I will talk through some initial thoughts still. Glintstone Pebble and Star Spiral buff. This is more of a PvE buff. For PvP, Swift Glintstone is way better, and Star Spiral, while usable as a delay tool, is very often avoided by any competent player. All you need is one simple roll, or a good strafe. Lightning Spear and Flame Sling. I'm fine with this change because it seems to only buff the charged versions, which are less often used. These incantations got increased stamina damage against guards. This is nice, and again, more option to deal with shields, which is in line with the other changes. While Crystal Burst isn't that great in PvP, this increased cast speed just might push it to semi-usable. I'll have to see how much faster it is. The real deal here is the Triple Rings buff. I already think the Triple Rings of Light is a decent incantation. I tried this already, and I really like having a bit more speed on this to make it more usable even against aggressive opponents. Assassin's Approach and Law of Causality. The duration extension is nice for Assassin's Approach, I suppose, but I don't really see the point of it for Causality. Causality already lasted quite long. The real issue is how much damage you kind of had to take before it went off, and the not very high amounts of damage when it does go off. I don't see this making this spell good at all. Increase Frostbite build-up to some ice spells, and increase Poison build-up to some poison spells. Honestly, if you've seen my PvP tier list for spells, I'd say these buffs are more than fair, and some even necessary. For example, the Frozen Armament got buffed from 48 Frost build-up to 63 Frost build-up, which is a 31.3% buff. However, even though it sounds like quite a big buff, it isn't nearly good enough to make this option good. I wouldn't mind if they were a bit more liberal with buffing a F tier spell. Even something like a 50% buff to 72 Frostbite buildup would be plenty fair. 31.3% without any scaling to Frostbite buildup. Not nearly good enough for this spell to be good. Poison Armament is in the same boat. For the Mist spells and Ice Crack, this buff does indeed make them better, as they were more usable to begin with. A bunch of FP reduction for sorceries and incantations. Some damage buff for Glintstone Stars, Magma Shot, and Blood Boon. Increased stamina damage against blocking targets. These all look good, as the majority of these spells are relatively FP inefficient, or less used. You know what? There's a whole lot of FP reduction. I don't want to mention it again, so here's the whole list of FP changes for spells and incantations. Thanks for helping me on this, Lumi. On the very right, we also have a list of big proportional reduction in FP cost for spells that have their FP cost reduced by over 20%. You can pause the video here to take a look at all of them. I think they're all fair changes. One thing though is while Night Comet isn't commonly used in PvP, it is probably the best spell overall for a pure sorcery build in PvE. It also got its FP cost reduced, probably because similar spells like the Comet have their FP cost reduced as well. I really don't mind my Night Wielder becoming even stronger, but you can see that the rest of the changes are more targeted towards making costly spells more accessible. Gavel of Haima, Glintstone Comet Shard, Comet, Cannon of Haima, Carrion Greatsword all got a decrease in FP consumption with an increased stamina damage toward cards. Nothing super exciting, but these are actually all decent spells that were already used here or there. As for the Briar's change, it really needed it. The blood loss buildup was just not nearly enough to justify costing FP, HP, and faith investment, while not being exactly fast. Is the buff big enough? I think they're a bit better to use. However, I think the main issue with these spells is your spell pool. There aren't other spells of the sort that requires the same type of stat investment into either faith for the requirements or arcane for the buildup. Therefore, I think more Briar spells in a DLC will naturally make these spells a lot better without needing to buff more numbers. However, I will reserve my final judgment for now, but the buff on these spells were certainly more than welcomed. As for Rancor Call and Ancient Death Rancor, decreased FP plus extended lifespan of these vengeful spirits. This is certainly an interesting buff. Now these two very annoying spells will chase you for even longer if they don't run themselves into the ground. The extended lifespan is A weird way to buff it, I would say. I think these two spells can be quite annoying already if the opponent didn't respond properly. I would have rather had a slight damage increase instead of chasing even further, honestly. More buffs to bat spells and a quality of life boost to Starlight. Nice. Stars of Ruin was kind of gutted last patch, so I don't mind it getting a buff because its tracking is already killed. It is a very inefficient spell in PvE, and this damage increase for charging it makes a lot of sense. Shatter Earth was really small and slow. It wasn't good at all, so a buff might make it better for PvE. Rock Blaster had a wonky hitbox for the staff portion. I hope they made it large enough and easier to hit. Fairly decent changes to Founding Rain of Stars. I think this makes it more usable for sure, without breaking anything, as it was an okay spell, although probably on the lower end of play rate. Magic Glint Blade. Well, now this is a weird one. They buffed its poise damage and damage, in addition to doing more damage to guarding enemies. This was already a decent spell in PvE, and one of the strongest setup spells in PvP. Even without the buff, it would have been fine, but the buff definitely makes this spell even better for casters. So is Carrion Piercer and Adulus, honestly. These three I've highlighted now are buffs to already decent, if not good spells. They'll definitely remain relatively popular. Gelmir's Fury was kinda bad. I think this all-round buff makes it better serve its purpose of being a huge AoE. For something you have to hold still for quite a while, I think it is a much more worth it trade-off now than it was before. More testing definitely has to be done, but I can totally see it upgraded in PvE by just reading the notes. Zammer Ice Storm, another bat spell with a decent buff. It was a bat spell because of its long cast time and recovery time, so this buff is targeted at the right issues the spell has. Shattering Crystal and Crystal Release. Yeah, both of these needed quite a bit of help, and it looks like both of them got some pretty sizable buffs. I think it'll be easier to use Shattering Crystals now. As for Crystal Release, I still don't really see this move being good. It was quite poor for an AoE around you. I think this one needs a raw damage buff. The ability to cast bubble spells while moving, and other buffs such as better hitbox and tracking are seriously nice improvements to the bubble spells. There isn't any staff that buffs these in particular, so I do agree they should be a bit stronger to make it onto more people's spell bars. Explosive Ghost Flame was just plain bad. There was simply nothing good about it, so I think the buffs are more than warranted, and probably not even enough to make this spell decent. Tibia's Summons needed help too. A faster cast definitely helps, but I would like to see the skeletons swing faster. Discus of Light is now super cheap, with an all-round buff too. I can totally see it being the Glintstone Pebble of Fate in PvE. PvP-wise, without tracking and the small projectile, it'll just be Glintstone Pebble 2, which basically means probably not great. Radagon's Ring of Light has a fairly long cast, so making it less punishing by shortening its recovery is a small and fair buff. Frozen Lightning Spear wasn't applying a whole lot of frost. If you actually landed, you're more likely to kill the enemy than frostbite them. This makes this incantation a bit better. Flame of the Fell God I don't think actually has a charged version. I think this is probably a translation issue. Whatever the case is, I think it's probably a buff, so that's nice, because this delayed explosion is kinda mediocre to begin with. These flame incantations were plain bad, so a buff seems perfectly well and all. Scouring Black Flame buff is nice. I thought this incantation was kind of mediocre before, only saved by its Black Flame application, but for its cast time, it wasn't superb. Noble Presence and Beast Claw. Nice. More buffs to less seen incantations. Again, they're sticking with the more stamina damage theme. Gurank's incantations also got slightly buffed. I like the Stone of Gurank buff. Hopefully the extended area of the projectile makes this incantation less likely to flop. Scarlet Aeonia got huge buffs, so you will feel less bad using something so bad. Frenzied Burst buff I think is fine. This only applies to the charged version, kind of like Lightning Spear. They definitely want to boost the power of the charged versions of some chargeable spells to promote people deciding between charging it or not. A fair idea to increase options. Howl of Shabiri got a much needed duration buff, and Inescapable Frenzy is now a tad bit easier to land while not being as punishing if you don't. Dragon Claw got a buff, but honestly, this one is still on the slow side of things. Definitely still better suited for PvE than PvP, and so is Dragon Maw. The hitbox increase is nice, because this one does whiff quite a bit. Some balance changes. These all seem fine and fair. The more notable thing is, Black Blade seems to have the old name Dragon Breath's issue, where you can't do the follow-up attack if the seal is held in your left hand. A nerf to Rot's build-up. I think a slight decrease is fine. Rot will still be strong. Honestly, the other Dragon Breaths all do more damage from the base breath, so you can just choose something else if you want. Now for the weapon arts. Other than Glintstone Pebble, the other buffs are for unique weapon arts, unless used unique weapons. Perfectly fair, honestly. As for Glintstone Pebble, I think the buff is fine as it's small. It got a huge nerf last patch, and I think they want this to be a better poking tool. But it wasn't even functioning great as a poking tool, considering this does scale to intelligence, and you have access to staffs, so a buff is fair. Slight recovery buffs for Sword Dance, Vow of the Indomitable, and Aokid's Dancing Blade. Nice, nothing game breaking. In fact, Vow could use a bigger buff. I bet you don't even know what this thing does. Why? Because it's irrelevant. Extended effect time for these ashes. Okay, all fair. They're not super good ashes, so I think it's fine. As for the Barricade shield buff, I think this is fair too. Overall, blocking did get nerfed this patch, so a longer Barricade shield is fair trade-off that makes this Ash of War actually feel like it's doing something. Remember, I covered in the beginning that this weapon art is now less effective on shields with higher guard boost, and more effective on weaker shields. Added damage detection to weapon parts. I think this makes sense. Imagine swinging your weapon and missing because you hit the enemy with a weapon. Increased power and poise damage of Prayerful Strike and Great Serpent Hunt. Sure. I wonder how this affects the Rykard fight. Buffing these moves with a bit better recovery and some attack power. I think they're all fair. These aren't completely weak moves, but they were nowhere near super powerful. I really like the Impaling Thrust and Piercing Fang buff. They were just too slow to land on PvP opponents. For PvE, they're kind of more targeted towards guarding enemies, as you had better options versus enemies that weren't guarding. A buff to damage and more importantly, making these two ashes faster is definitely welcomed. It'll feel much smoother to weave the weapon art into your attacks. Spinning Slash dealt more poise damage and was faster on the quick version of Spinning Slash, which made no sense. I'm glad they're buffing the poise damage of the slow version. I will need to test Charge Forth, but turning and faster speed sounds appealing for sure. I find it kind of annoying how a lot of running forward moves are slow as heck, even though they feel like they should be fast. Blood Tax and Repeating Thrust are quite similar moves. Making them faster is a nice call. Previously, these were not popular for sure because of their slow speed, just like Impaling Thrust and Piercing Fang. More poise damage to Giant Hunt. I guess it makes sense this move deals massive poise damage, but I thought it already deals quite a bit of poise damage, and even knocks smaller enemies up regardless. I guess the poise damage buff was more for PvE, while the faster recovery benefits PvP too. Loretta's Slash. Very punishable Ash that's backloaded. A buff is nice. The Loretta's War Sickle version is also buffed by the way, which will be mentioned later. I'll need to go check if the unique version is still crap. Poison Moth Flight. A very clickbaitable Ash where poison attempts to beat bleed with extra steps. They changed it from applying regular poison to deadly poison, which is a great buff, especially because you're removing the poison with this effect. It makes sense to apply a shorter and stronger poison. Stormcaller, truly a slow Ash before. Now, I actually think this move might be quite good. I think it will be included in one of my builds down the line, as I believe you might be able to true combo this move depending on enemy poise. Sacred Blade buff. Yeah, perfectly fine. Even more buffs to mediocre ashes. Nice. Gravitas buff shows you that they're trying to give some things more active poise while making poise damage stronger this patch. Stormblade and Lightning Slash buff. Nice. These really needed it. Stormblade was just kind of crap as a ranged option, especially in PvP. It was very much outshined by Beast's Roar. I've seen the new Stormblade in action, and I think it's much better now, with a different style than Beast's Roar, where chaining it into itself is much faster. Lightning Slash was too slow for a very melee attack and buffed your weapon. This buff will hopefully make it smoother to use, and you won't need to slash as often for the lightning buff if that's what you mainly use it for. As for Flaming Strike buff, oh boy. This was already a very strong PvP weapon art. They triple buffed it. It actually makes me kind of sad that one of the best, if not the best strength hash for PvP is buffed so much, especially when the lingering flame hitbox still remains. I wouldn't be surprised if this is banned on ladder. Again, another page of overall mediocre weapon arts. The best one might be Phantom Slash for PvE, and it's only getting a small buff here. All fine I think, but nothing that'll make any of these meta. Some more buffs to more mediocre weapon arts. Glad Spectral Lance builds might actually be able to do without Arrow's Reach Talisman. And the Mist weapon arts being smoother to cast while having twice the duration of the weapon buff is nice. Honestly, the buff duration was kind of short, and the buff itself wasn't particularly great, so this should make these ashes a bit more of a consideration. Shield Bash doing more stamina damage to shields. How ironic. Enchanted Shot got buffed, but not Sky Shot? What the heck is Sky Shot even for anyway? Why isn't it getting a double damage buff with faster arrow drop down? Kick finally breaks shields. I won't give any credit to From for doing this because this change should have been made several patches ago. Imagine an Ash of War meant to break guard, doing next to no stamina damage to higher guard boost shields. These are the new details for Crackblade. Honestly, it needed this buff. Crackblade is a slow buff to cast, kind of like Seppuku, but its effect was nowhere close. The Roar Ash got buffed. These weren't powerful effects to begin with, so a buff should more readily allow the player to feel the effects of the weapon arts, which should be the intended purpose of these weapon arts. Endure IMO is honestly overbuffed. Remember, Endure also increases your negation by 45%. Now some people will tell you, you simply outrange the guy using Endure, but the enemy can be using a long weapon too. Other people will tell you to simply run. Yeah, sure, but the cost is cheap, and the enemy has a free pressure tool. It basically turns Endure sort of like Royal Knight's Resolve, where trading while they have the buff up is just not smart. Furthermore, this patch also wants to nerf poise, but Endure pretty much means that you can poise anything, even with zero poise. I think preventing status stuns and reducing recovery for Endure would have been good enough already. Maybe even an extra 0.5 seconds is fine. But they turned fast Endure from 2.5 seconds to 4.5 seconds long, and slow Endure from 3 seconds to 5 seconds long. In the hands of a good player, this Ash of War is really strong right now. Okay, some mild buffs. Some more buffs to less used weapons. Fixed Moonlight Greatsword's detection issues, but wow, decreased stamina cost. Without needing any FP, Moonlight Greatsword is already a menace in PvE. Less stamina cost will make it even stronger. More buffs to unique weapon arts to make them feel better. Siluria's was way slow for the amount of damage it actually dealt. Bloodblade was buffed, so it makes sense the unique counterpart is also buffed, which is basically the same for Glintstone Darts because Glintstone Pebble is buffed. Soul Nath buff. This is most likely a small damage buff, because it wouldn't make sense to make this weapon OP in PvE again. The small buff is nice though, as although it was still usable after the nerf, it didn't feel quite as legendary. Ruinous Ghostflame buff. I'm happy with this one. Helfen's Steeple was too close to Moonlight Greatsword in my opinion. I thought it was on the weaker side due to its short duration, and the fact that you get a good heavy attack for Moonlight Greatsword. Buffing its weapon art will really make it stand out more as a stronger melee option. And Spearcaller Ritual, a fine buff too. The weapon art was kind of mid. Some minor changes to Wolf's Assault to let it better tank the higher poise damage before it goes airborne, and a better control on Thundercloud form. Thundercloud form feels smoother when you're changing directions now. Regal Roar, honestly, can't comment much on this one, cause I only lightly tried out Axe of Godfrey and sort of just concluded it's kind of bad. Next, they seem to want to make the max HP debuff last a bit longer. The two Lords Pull and Push. Pretty sure I took a dump on both of these weapons in my Curved Greatsword and Greatsword videos. I doubt the buff is enough to make them good though. Oath of Vengeance had an endure-like effect to it as well. This is a buff to that part of its effect, which is nice for Grafted Blade Greatsword because its endure-like effect was way short. Ice Lightning Sword buff. Nice. This was kind of weak by the time you get it normally through PvE. A meme weapon buff. Ooh. The Paired Straight Sword buff. It looks like mostly a buff to its heavy attack, which is what makes the ornamental sword unique. The increased duration and power of the holy buff is nice too, making this a better straight sword consideration. Last Rites buff. Wow, they really want you to murder skeletons with this one. This is for Coded Swords weapon art, which is actually quite fast now. I think you can actually use it even in PvP as a mix-up tool. Yup, no comment on this one yet. I'll need to see the numbers to see if I'm disappointed. Corpse Wax Cutter definitely needed a buff. In my Greatsword video, I said it was just lackluster, especially when it's so similar to Blasphemous Blade's weapon art. I doubt it'll be much better, but some love is nice. Zammer Ice Storm buff. The weapon art was already stronger than the spell version. I think this is going to be a relatively nice option in PvE. Better directional control. Okay, we'll need to see how this feels. A buff to Eclipse Shoto's weapon art. I think that's fine. Death Blight isn't that easy to apply. Slight increase on Magma Guillotine, which I'm in favor of. This is clearly supposed to feel like a heavy attack, so a stamina damage buff suits it. Poor Rivers of Blood was kind of gutted, so a little increase in damage is nice. Minor changes here, not much to say. Familiar Rancor was garbage. It still is. Rosas' summons might be better now, depending on how much faster the skeleton attacks. Stormcaller was buffed, so they wanted to make the unique version a bit stronger. Increased speed is probably not needed actually, as this was already a strong weapon art. This unblockable blade is the Cypher Pata version. Definitely feels nicer too, although I had hoped they would have given it a tad bit more distance or faster cast speed like the coded version. Ordovis' Vortex is such a big change. It got so much faster. There really was no reason at all before 1.07 to use this crap greatsword, unless you really wanted to cosplay Crucible Knights. Barbaric Roar change. Not sure why the Twin Blade version is nerfed actually. Shield Crash nerf, definitely because of Fingerprint Shield. Seppuku I actually pity, because while this was OP, I think it got over nerfed. I checked the numbers for this already. Wow, a 64.3% reduction for a long buff to cast. I know it was OP, but combined with the fact that power stance status effects are nerfed, I think this is still usable, but not nearly as great now. A 50% nerf would have sufficed, I believe. Yes, Mog's annoyingly big weapon art that deals a bazillion damage if you're caught inside. A radius nerf is well deserved. And that's it for now, guys. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the full numbers breakdown that is inevitably going to be even longer than this video. If you want to keep this channel afloat, do buy my book, and you can also request a topic or expedite any video. See you next time.